much, Professor Usha Rani, for that introduction, and I want to thank colleagues at Tezpur University for inviting me to this conversation. What I will do is I will share a PowerPoint slide with you to go through and specifically talk about the work of the Center for Culture-Centered Approach to Research and Evaluation, and refer to the work that we have been doing with migrant laborers across India, Singapore, Aotearoa, New Zealand, within the context of COVID-19. But I will also draw upon my experience working with the World Health Organization on its expert advisory panel on cultural context of health, and particularly in terms of developing COVID-19 related responses. So my talk is specifically going to address the question of radical democracies. I will operationalize what I mean by radical democracies and the urgency of building a socialist politics in the backdrop of the pandemic. The author, activist Arundhati Roy talked about the pandemic being a portal. This is also a concept that is highlighted by Naomi Klein, who talks about the pandemic offering us an opportunity to reorganize the world. And in the first part of the presentation, I will outline the argument behind reorganization. Why do we need to reorganize? And then in the second part of the talk, I will specifically talk about the role of communication as the basis for imagining radical democracies. I will, in this context, draw upon the theoretical framework of the culture-centered approach, or the CCA, that I have been working on over the last 2 decades. Quite a bit of this work takes place within the context of India, within the context of our collaborations with indigenous communities, communities in extreme poverty, as well as precarious migrant workers in India. But of course, this work also extends to the advocacy and activist interventions that we develop within the context of Singapore, Malaysia, Indonesia, Nepal, Aotearoa, New Zealand, and the US. I will talk about the concept of communicative equality and discuss the ways in which it helps us to reimagine and reorganize the role of communication, and then finally wrap up with an invitation to reimagine the role of academics, the role of civil society in the context of the question of solidarity with those at the margin. So I will begin by arguing that one of the things that becomes visible with COVID-19, and of course, for most of us that pay attention to the empirical evidence, this evidence has been mounting over the last 2 decades, is that health inequalities have grown dramatically across the globe, between countries as well as within countries. The divide between the haves and have-nots have increased dramatically. And of course, this divide is foregrounded by COVID-19, where both in terms of the trajectories of COVID-19 as well as the impacts of policy responses to COVID-19 make visible these deep entrenched inequalities. So as you can see in this image, and this is also sort of the narrative of the various contexts where we do our work, whether it is in India or whether it is in Singapore, where you see stark differences between the haves and the have-nots, between those with access to economic and political resources and those that are placed at the margins of these economic and political systems. So when you look at the narrative, or the ongoing and overarching narrative of development, the one that is celebratory, that talks about techno-urban utopias, is a narrative that is an ideological construction, is a narrative that is a mythology constructed actively by those in positions of power, and it's a narrative that works to erase or hide the deep inequalities that are produced by the ongoing neoliberal reforms. So what happened with the pandemic, and of course you witnessed this in India, is that you saw large numbers of migrant workers thrown into the streets when the lockdown was implemented without any notice. Now, for most of the urban middle classes and upwardly aspiring classes, one of the narratives you often heard is that one didn't know that there were so many migrant workers in the city. So where were the migrant workers? And this is the very nature of neoliberal city making, where it actually works to erase those precarities, those deep inequalities, and those sites of exploitation that in fact are integral to holding up these cities and urban spaces. So the pandemic draws attention to the deeply unequal structures that constitute our societies today, with 3 decades of market-oriented neoliberal reforms. As the market has been projected as the panacea to poverty, again as a mythology, what you see in evidence is that large cross-sections of the population, particularly across the global margins, are left without access to opportunities for laying claims to education, laying claims to work and income and therefore mobility, laying claims to decent housing infrastructures, laying claims to decent access to food, and laying claims to decent places of living. So the structural features of our lives that constitute the inequalities of our lives are obfuscated by the narrative of the market and the narrative of poverty alleviation that places the market as the panacea to these struggles with education, income, and livelihood. You certainly, in a lot of my work, I talk about Singapore being an example or an exemplar of authoritarian neoliberalism, or what might be called extreme neoliberalism, in terms of production of techno fetish in the service of the market, that actually actively uses those authoritarian techniques to silence worker protest, worker organizing, and worker claims to rights to these fundamental resources. So when one sees, for instance, the celebration of the neoliberal narrative, and you certainly see this in how it interpolates to the context of India, particularly in terms of the production of the smart city imaginary, where many of you will be familiar with this. Singapore is projected as the destination. What you do not see in that narrative or what you do not hear in that narrative are stories of large numbers of migrant workers who live in precarity without access to fundamental conditions of decent housing, decent living, and without access to unions to lay claims to decent working conditions. In addition to that, the conditions of the workers are precarious, such that at any point of time, the workers can be deported if the employers so wish. And the state as well has a series of authoritarian policies in place that prevent workers from organizing, from gathering, or raising their voices. Now, this kind of structural context, then, in terms of the lack of access to the fundamental resources of life, is situated in the backdrop of an authoritarian state that works in the service of the market. So, the narrative of the free market, and you go back to Milton Friedman and the ideas of the free market being emancipatory and liberatory. But of course, it obfuscates us that integral to its functioning is a strong state, often an authoritarian state, that enables the market and the sites of capitalist production to reproduce by the repression of labor, through the active repression of labor. Now, this is constituted in the backdrop of the lack of fundamental access to preventive resources, to healthcare resources. So in most of these contexts, workers, migrant laborers do not have the fundamental right to healthcare, and that is not actually coded into policy. Inequalities in distribution of the basic resources of life and livelihood that then work alongside inequalities in access to care as well as quality of care. So these features of inequalities can be tied to capitalist systems and their modes of organizing, and particularly so to the context of extreme capitalism that you see play out under the structures of neoliberalism, and particularly 21st century neoliberalism, where profit extraction is achieved through the exploitation of labor, but also through the ongoing exploitation of new frontiers of ecosystems and destruction of ecosystems, which is integral to the displacement of communities at the margins into the circuits of capital. The precarization of work, where the ongoing onslaught and attack on worker unions has translated into workers not having the fundamental right to organize and to be represented by unions. So when you consider, for instance, the actual problematic of the workers that you witnessed on the streets of India without access to food, without access to shelter, without access to transportation, to get back home. Consider the story of the workers that went to the railway station, found the station to be closed, started walking on the railway line, and then were trampled over by the train. Now, those conditions of exploitation are constituted amidst the attack on unions, such that workers in most of those precarious sectors are not represented by unions and sites of collective bargaining. This is constituted amidst privatization of public resources. You, of course, are seeing ongoing privatization of public resources in India, the latest being the railways. And again, under the neoliberal narrative that privatization will emancipate and create conditions of access for those at the margins. So one of the critical elements of this neoliberal narrative is this, and this is where communication becomes vital, is this work of propaganda in propping up a story of the market that is not borne out by empirical evidence. If indeed the market worked, one would wonder why exactly do migrant workers in a neoliberal Mecca such as Singapore continue to be bonded in labor without being able to actually move out of their poverty and get back home. Of course, contrary to that materiality and that empiricism, the neoliberal narrative that is projected on our screen is one of the mobility through pathways of Singapore and through Singapore's neoliberal imaginaries into spaces outside of poverty. Of course, one of the things that we have consistently demonstrated in the work of care is how workers often stay in the work, stay in precarious conditions, even when they do not want to stay in those conditions because they are bonded to the debt that they had taken out in order to come to Singapore, because they make very little in terms of saving money to be actually sending back home, and because they do not really see a way out of that condition. So bondage becomes a really fascinating way to look at a counterpoint to this neoliberal narrative. There's also privatization of communal resources and community resources. You increasingly see our fundamental spaces of access to what we consider as basic resources, like water, like air, being commoditized and turned into private entities to be secured through the market. And within this framework, then, historically, development and particularly health communication, where I specialize, has worked in the service of capital, in the service of the ideology of the free market, and particularly through two particular prongs. One is the ideology of individualism. So in a lot of health communication work historically, and this is the dominant state of health communication work, I certainly see this in WHO and have offered critiques to this in my role with the WHO, which is the ideology of individualism, which assumes that human behavior is a product of individual choices, is a product of individual attitudes and beliefs, and therefore the panacea to that is to produce the right kind of messaging. So a lot of the health communication work, therefore, focuses on how do we produce the right kind of message, the effective message that would generate the right kind of behavior in the target audience. Of course, completely obfuscating the structural context within which people live their lives. So when it comes to, for instance, the struggles of low-wage migrant workers, and again, I take the example of Singapore, the messaging focuses on how do you ask migrant workers to practice healthy behaviors such as physical distancing, of course, completely erasing the empirical evidence that migrant workers at the start of the pandemic in Singapore often were packed like sardines with 20, 21 workers in one room, often without a window, and often with less than 1 meter of space to move. So behavior you see within this context, and this is something we demonstrated consistently through our work in the midst of pandemic, that was also picked up by media outlets such as The Guardian and Time, that talked about this notion of behaviors being situated within structural contexts. So it's important to recognize that no amount of effective or efficient or smart messaging would actually work in producing behavior change when communities at the margins don't fundamentally have the structures to participate in those behaviors. In fact, what we have demonstrated empirically through our work is that those are the conditions where that kind of messaging actually produces a great deal of risks to mental health. So, in the ethnographic work we have been doing with migrant workers, they talk about feeling suicidal, feeling depressed, feeling anxiety because of not knowing what would happen, not knowing if they would get infected. And in fact, when you look at the statistics of Singapore, then it is separated out into the statistics for the community and statistics for migrant workers, which demonstrates that deeply entrenched racist classes system that fundamentally thinks of workers as other, as less than, so that they can be counted as something else in the state's narrative of efficient pandemic management. This is also tied to an ideology of techno-determinism, where technology is proposed as a solution to poverty, where technology is positioned as a solution to, within this context, the challenges with COVID. And once again, what gets obfuscated in that is the role of technology as a site of data gathering, as a site of surveillance, and as a site of control. Particularly if you think about, for instance, again, I take the example of Singapore, the Trace Together app that was created by the government. This app was created within the backdrop of a surveillance state that has cameras everywhere and that has strict authoritarian rules about organizing and expressing voice. So in fact, recall that we talked about the sense of fear that is expressed by workers. They often talk about that sense of fear that is connected to being surveilled, being watched, being fearful about whether they can speak out about their conditions and challenges. So COVID-19 in this sense plays out in the trajectories of infection. So this is an image from the migrant worker dormitories in Singapore, where I gave the example of housing, for instance, where the lack of adequate and decent housing is a site where the pandemic plays out. Lack of adequate and decent sanitation. We had workers sending us pictures of toilets that were clogged up, where water was overflowing. They had situations where they didn't have access to enough water to wash their hands and wash themselves. So again, you look at the recommendation that WHO makes about hand washing, and then think about it within that structural context. And what you see is that the place, the access to places of living and livelihood, access to decent housing really become vital. a lack of clean drinking water, and then our work on an ongoing basis highlighted lack of decent food, where workers talked about getting sick because they didn't have access to decent food in the midst of the pandemic. Now, within the context of India, we have completed 97 in-depth interviews with migrant workers, and some of the emergent themes in that work are quite similar to the emergent themes here in terms of the pandemic actually placing the workers in the face of risk, and particularly so in terms of the pandemic response. So it is actual implementation of the lockdown, which is the intervention or the policy that further exposes those at the margins to risks because their bodies become expendable. This also plays out, as we see in our work, in terms of lack of wage and income. This plays out in Singapore, this plays out in India, this also plays out in Aotearoa and New Zealand. In fact, we just published a study in health communication based on interviews with migrants and refugees that talk about the state having a fairly effective response because it also is organized around the logics of equal distribution of resources. And in spite of that, there being struggles with accessing decent income within the context of the lockdown. Experiences of food insecurity continues to emerge consistently in our empirical work. Barriers to accessing testing, accessing healthcare and costs of healthcare. And again, the pandemic itself then placing the people in cycles of poverty. So within this backdrop, the culture-centered approach argues that we need to think of, first of all, inverting the dominant framework of doing health and development communication that focuses on communication as messaging and really narrowly defines the work of communication as sending out messages, and instead look at communication as voice, as an opening for listening to the voices of the margins and those at the margins of the margins, and situated at the interplays of culture, structure, and agency. So structures being systems of organizing of social resources, cultures referring to the everyday contexts, frameworks, interpretive frames and meanings through which communities make sense of their lives, and agency being the everyday capacity of individuals, households, communities to make sense of their conditions and to negotiate them through participation in activities, both to negotiate the structures as well as to transform them. So the culture-centered approach in this suggests that the work of transforming structures lies at the heart of building health communication and creating health outcomes that are equitable. So, you could think about the initial part of the presentation that talked about the pandemic being a site of inequalities. The question then in terms of how do we transform these inequalities? How do we change these landscapes of inequalities? The culture-centered approach argues that we need to think about how resources are distributed, and particularly imagining a politics of redistribution of preventive resources, health resources, income and wealth, and opportunities of life. So just to give you this Amazon example, one of the things I'm sure you've read in the news how Amazon had its largest profits in the midst of the pandemic. Even as you read that story, another part of the story that is often missing from mainstream media is a story of Amazon workers going on strike for not having access to fundamental preventive resources while packing, while distributing the packages. So that's an example in terms of what communication actually can look like as organizing in transforming these deeply unequal structures, where the work of health communication in that sense becomes one of articulating and crafting processes of resistance to these structures of deep capitalism. Communicative inequalities, the culture-centered approach argues, are deeply intertwined with structural inequalities, the erasure of the voices of communities at the margins, the erasure of spaces of representation and recognition of those at the margins, the erasure of the precarious and working classes is fundamentally intertwined with their material oppression, their exploitation, and their deprivation from fundamental structural resources. So then the work of the CCA seeks to build communicative equality, where we look at the question of equality in the ownership of communicative resources. And this is where the argument about radical democracy comes in, where we operationalize radical democracy as communities at the margins and communities at the margins of the margins, owning the communicative resources, information resources, resources of representation and decision making, and most fundamentally, resources for voice. This is an image from our ongoing work with the Deccan Development Society and with Dalit women farmers organized under DDS in the form of sanghams. And what their work teaches us is that the struggle for communicative equality is about struggles at the margins for having a voice so that they can actually shape the narrative and the imaginary of development. In the work of the DDS women, their participation in ownership of these communication resources is fundamental to the articulation of an alternative imaginary of agriculture that fundamentally dismantles and disrupts the neoliberal imaginary of agriculture, which again is highly relevant today in the context of the farmer protests that are taking place across India, where farmers have been systematically disenfranchised from their spaces of livelihood through, again, 3 decades of technocentric neoliberal reforms carried out in the language of development. So, of course, as development scholars, it is particularly salient for us to recognize the ways in which the language of development has been fundamental to the disenfranchisement, both structurally and communicatively, of communities at the margins. So the question then translates into how do we build information infrastructures where communities at the margins can make knowledge claims, can claim structural resources of development and democracy through democratic participation, and where they can participate in decision-making processes. And similarly then, how do we build resources for voice that are owned by communities at the margins, all the way from making decisions to accessing structural resources and distributing them to making knowledge claims. Communication in this sense is rooted in voice, in the question of voices of the margins, and it's tied to power, recognizing that communicative acts, communicative processes are imbued in terrains of power. And to shift these communicative processes, we fundamentally need to change the logics of organizing of power. So this idea of voice then fundamentally dismantles this notion of techno-determinism that works through communication as a form of erasure by incorporating communication as messaging into the state, civil society, market relationship to serve the agendas of capital. And seeing this mechanism as a site for reproducing inequalities can become the basis for us to actually ask, how do we build spaces for listening to the voices of the margins? And this is where the CCA methodologically draws inspiration from the work of Gayatri Spivak, who invites us to learn from below. So how do we build habits to learn from below? How do we build an ethic of listening to the other? Particularly, this is a powerful question in the context of development, and it calls for us to have a great deal of humility in terms of learning to listen. And it's really interesting because when I do this presentation within the context of development work or development organizations, the response often is, but isn't this community engagement? And my argument to that is that no, that this is not community engagement, because community engagement still keeps power intact in the hands of development agencies and institutions, often situated in close relationship to the logics of capital. So building voice infrastructures at the margins is about building radical democracies where communities at the margins can participate to assert their rights to communication, their right to have a say, and in fundamentally imagining development, in fundamentally imagining COVID responses in ways that are meaningful to their lives. So I will give you an example from an article we recently published in a work that looks at Maori or indigenous responses to COVID-19 in Aotearoa, New Zealand. So something that happened in the early part of the pandemic when the country went into the lockdown, when Jacinda Ardern announced the lockdown, was that many indigenous communities organized in the form of iwi. So Maori are organized as iwi or tribal groups, and the iwi started putting together checkpoints where the iwi would actually monitor who entered into the community and who left the community, and therefore also regulating movement. That's an excellent example of indigenous-led, community-led intervention, where communities asserted their sovereignty, or what is considered in Te Reo Maori as Pinoranga Tiratanga, to determine what would be meaningful and healthy for them. And this becomes a basis for working toward another imagination that actually challenges the techno-deterministic, expert-driven narrative that we often see dominate our global organizations. The work of the CCA, therefore, by addressing these spaces of communicative equality, works toward actually building a socialist politics where distribution of knowledge resources is placed in the hands of communities, where communities organizing, workers organizing, lay claims to rights for distribution of preventive resources of income, education, shelter, and food. So in our most recent work, for instance, with migrant workers, the question that is often emergent from the workers is that how can workers organize into unions so that they can actually lay claims to fundamental conditions of living and livelihood at their workplaces. So this work of co-creating infrastructures, and I will wrap up with this, is about building community groups at the margins and learning to learn together the habits of democracy, to intervene into state structures so that these state structures are held accountable to the voices at the margins. Design frameworks that critically analyze power and interplace power. And I think this is really vital. And when we talk about work with migrant workers in Singapore, they will often be the first ones to critically interrogate the state narrative that coming to Singapore is a way for upward mobility for workers. And they will point to their conditions and demonstrate the ways in which coming to Singapore often is akin to labor trafficking, where they have traveled to Singapore without having adequate information, put in a huge amount of debt to come to Singapore, often close to 10,000 to 15,000 Singapore dollars, and then are stuck in that cycle of debt-based labor. Describing and erasing the sites of erasure, workers talk about how their voices are systematically erased and the ways in which these are situated within structures. And this serves as the basis for co-creating pedagogies of democracy, for habits of participation and building interventions from within communities. And of course, when these interventions take place from within communities at the margins, the dominant structure, the state structure, often in the service of capital and the market, as I argued earlier, responses with repression. So it's also about anticipating and building strategies for response. I will leave my presentation with these two quotations from two of our community organizers that have worked for a long time on culture-centered interventions. And both of them make a fundamental point about how we organize health and development communication. And they argue that we need to begin by building infrastructures of listening. So Rosie says, and listen to this, the powerful want to tell things the way they see them. So in that sense, development agencies, academics, civil society organizations work in the service of power, those with power, in their own way. in ways that feed their interests. So then she asks, what is your role? Listen to us, work with us, collaborate on things that we can do on the ground that represent our interests. This articulation of our interests is really important in how she is imagining the role of the academic. It has been so many times that our interests are not really heard. The community feels isolated and no place to go to. So we work together in making the avenues where our voices can be heard, such that, and this is key, such that they matter. And then I will end with this excerpt from Nadamma, who is a really inspiring women leader farmer at Deccan Development Society. And she says, when we hold these cameras, and she's talking about their work with community radio and video-based storytelling, she says, we tell our stories when we hold these cameras. When we run the radio station in the community, we tell the stories grounded in our lives. So it's not the money that the big people pay to sell their version. You know, she's referring to the radio advertising that circulates on the internet. Always about making profit by making fools of us. So on the radio, these are stories of what farmers are really going through here in Warangal and Pastapur. And she's really articulating this in the backdrop of the farmer suicides that have plagued the country. That is another pandemic plaguing India. So with respect to COVID, I will leave you with this particular image. That the question for us is, how do we build spaces for community ownership in the everyday? Thank you so much.